The night hung thick over the small apartment, a single lamp casting a weak glow across the cluttered room. Papers strewn on the table, a chipped mug cold with yesterday's coffee, and Micah sat hunched, his fingers tracing the cracked leather of his grandfather's Bible, its pages worn from decades of hands. His own trembling now, a weight pressing his chest, guilt he couldn't name gnawing at him, a young Christian raised on hymns and potlucks, but drowning in secrets. Late night screens, fleeting thoughts, choices he'd buried under prayers that felt hollow. And he wondered, staring at the ceiling, why God felt so far. Why the faith he'd clung to since childhood seemed to fray at the edges. A life split between Sunday's light and shadows he couldn't shake. His eyes drifted to the Bible, opened to Proverbs, but a loose note slipped free, yellowed and creased, his grandfather's scrawl jagged across it. 7 sins God hates, sexual shadows, Proverbs 6:16. And his breath caught, his pulse quickening, because he'd heard of sin, sure. But this hit different, a list he didn't know, a truth he'd never faced, and he flipped fast. Proverbs 6:16 to 19. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable. But the note went on, adultery, fornication, more. And he stopped, his throat tight, because this wasn't the vague don't sin he'd grown up with. This was specific, sharp, a blade cutting through the fog he'd lived in. He leaned back, the chair creaking, his mind racing. What did God really say? Not the pastor's soft words, not the world's shrugs, but God. And he saw it. The culture screaming freedom in every ad, every swipe, sex casual, normal, no big deal. But his heart thudded heavy, the shame whispering different, the nights he justified, the lies he told himself, and he wondered, had he missed it? Had they all? Because this note, this list, it wasn't judgment. It was a warning, a father's voice, not a whip, and he needed to know, needed to face it, whatever it was. The lamp flickered, the city humming outside, and he saw his grandfather's face in his mind, weathered and kind, preaching fire and grace, a man who'd lived this book, who'd left this note like a map, and Micah felt it, a pull, a hunger. Why these 7? Why sexual sins? What's God protecting? Because he'd felt the wreckage, the emptiness after, the way it clawed at his soul, his relationships, his peace, and he couldn't unsee it, couldn't unfeel it, the disconnect between who he was and who he wanted to be. He grabbed a pen, his hands shaking. Adultery, what's that mean really? And he wrote fast, his grandfather's note a spark, because this wasn't about rules. This was about life, about hurt he'd caused, about a God who cared enough to say stop. And he saw his friend's face, broken by a cheating spouse, his own past flings, fleeting and hollow. And it hit him. God wasn't out to shame him. He was out to save him, to pull him from a pit he hadn't named till now. The clock ticked loud, the night pressing in, and he flipped to Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fall short. And his chest eased, a crack of light, because he wasn't alone, wasn't doomed. But this list, these 7, they were real, they were heavy, and he had to know them, had to face them, because the shame wasn't the end. It was the start, a call to something better, something free. He dropped the pen, his voice a whisper. I'll find it, I'll dig it out, I'll see. Because this wasn't just guilt, it was a lifeline, a truth buried under years of half-preached sermons, a God who loved him enough to warn him, and he vowed it then, his heart pounding. I'll chase it, I'll know it, I'll break free, because the shadows weren't his home, the light was, and you felt the weight, but are you ready for the truth beneath? Comment, I'm ready below, hit that subscribe button, because this journey's just starting, and what's next will change everything you thought you knew. The morning broke gray over the apartment, a dull light seeping through the blinds, the air thick with the hum of traffic below, and Micah sat at the kitchen table, his grandfather's Bible open, the note from last night pinned under his coffee mug. 7 sins God hates. Its words a drumbeat in his skull, the weight of unseen guilt still heavy but shifting now. A spark of something else flickering, a need to know, to face what he'd dodged too long. Because that list, those shadows, they weren't just words. They were chains, and he'd felt them. Late-night regrets, broken trust. And he couldn't shake it, couldn't unsee the crack in his faith, the gap between what he'd lived and what God called him to. He flipped to Exodus 20, his finger tracing the stone-cut law. You shall not commit adultery. And his breath hitched, his mind flashing to Jake, his best friend from youth group, voice cracked over the phone last year. She cheated, man. It's over. And Micah had sat there, numb, nodding like he understood. But now it hit different. Adultery, not just a word, but a betrayal. A sacred promise snapped. And he saw Jake's kids wide-eyed at the split, the ripple of pain spreading wide. Proverbs 6:32 screaming in his head, he who commits adultery destroys himself. And he felt it, the truth slicing deep, not just Jake's wife, but him, his own soul frayed by secrets, because this wasn't abstract. This was real. This was why God cared. He scribbled fast. Marriage, a covenant, God's design. And his pen paused, his chest tight, because he'd never married, sure. But he'd played loose, college nights blurring into hookups, casual, no strings, the world shrugging it off. Everyone does it. But 1 Corinthians 6:18 burned through. Flee from sexual immorality. It's a sin against your own body. And he stopped, his mug trembling in his grip. Fornication. That's what it was. Not love, not connection. Just fleeting highs that left him emptier. And he saw her face. Sarah, sophomore year. Eyes soft till he ghosted her. The hurt he'd brushed off. The bond he'd broken. Because God made intimacy sacred. Not casual. A gift for marriage. Not a toy for his boredom. The room spun slow. The coffee bitter on his tongue. And he saw it clear. Adultery wrecked Jake's world. Fornication wrecked his own. Both twisting something beautiful, something God built, into shards that cut everyone. And he wondered, how had he missed this? How had he justified it? Because the culture screamed freedom, movies, songs, apps, all glorifying it. But his heart thudded heavy, the lie peeling back. God's warning, not a cage, but a shield. A father saying, this hurts you, this hurts them. I've got better. He leaned back, his chair creaking, and he saw his grandfather's note again. 7 sins. And these two, adultery, fornication, they were just the start, the tip of a shadow he'd lived in, and he felt it. A sting of guilt, but something else. Hope, a crack of light, because Romans 3:23 echoed, all have sinned, and he wasn't alone, wasn't doomed, but he had to face it, had to name it, and he whispered low, God, I've messed up. I've hurt them. I've hurt me. And his eyes burned, Psalm 51 flashing. David, adulterer, forgiven, because this wasn't the end. This was a door, a chance to turn, and he saw Jake again, broken but rebuilding. Sarah's silence, a wound he'd left, and he knew. God didn't hate him. He hated this, the wreckage, the pain, the way it tore at his design. The blinds rattled in the breeze, the city waking outside, and he grabbed the Bible. Hebrews 13:4, let marriage be held in honor, the bed undefiled. And his voice shook. That's it. That's what I missed. Because it wasn't rules, it was life. Intimacy meant to bind, not break. And he'd trashed it, tossed it for cheap thrills, but not anymore. Not if God could fix it, and he felt it. A vow clawing up. I'm sorry, I'll stop. I'll seek you. Because this wasn't shame. This was waking. A father's voice calling him back. And he saw his reflection in the mug. Tired but alive. A man who'd run but could return. The traffic roared louder. The morning stretching wide. And he knew this was just the start. 2 sins down, 5 to go. A list that scared him but freed him. Because God's grace was bigger, his mercy deeper, and he had to keep digging, had to know the rest, because the shadows weren't his home, the light was. And you've felt the break, but are you ready for the mend? Comment, I'm ready below. Smash that subscribe button, because this truth's unfolding fast, and what's next will shake you to your core. The afternoon sun slanted harsh through the coffee shop window, a buzz of chatter filling the air, the clink of cups a steady hum, and Micah sat across from Eli, his mentor from church, a gray-haired man with eyes sharp but kind. His grandfather's Bible opened between them, the note, 7 sins God hates, creased under Micah's fingers, adultery and fornication still raw in his mind from yesterday, their weight a stone in his gut. But today was different. Today he'd face the shadows inside, the ones he'd hid longest, because the guilt wasn't just about what he'd done, it was what he'd thought, what he'd watched, and he couldn't dodge it anymore. Not with Eli's steady gaze holding him, not with God's word whispering freedom through the cracks of his shame. He took a breath, his voice low. It's lust, Eli, and worse. Stuff I've seen. Late nights, screens. And Eli nodded slow, no flinch, no judgment, just a hand on the Bible. Matthew 5:28. Anyone who looks with lustful intent has committed adultery in his heart. And Micah's chest tightened, his hands gripping the table, because he knew it, felt it, those stolen glances on the street, the endless scroll through feeds. Images burned into his brain, and he saw her, not Sarah this time, but every face he'd turned into a thing, an object, not a soul, and it stung, Jesus' words cutting deeper than any sermon. It's not just the act, it's the heart, and he'd thought he was safe. Thought it didn't count if he didn't touch. But this was sin. This was real. Eli leaned in, his voice firm. It's a seed, Micah. Lust plants it. Pornography waters it. 1 Corinthians 6:19. Your body's a temple, not your own. And Micah's throat dried, his mind flashing. Those nights, phone glowing, a click, then another. Promises of thrill turning to ash, shame creeping in after, because it wasn't harmless, wasn't private. It rewired him, dulled him, left him numb to the real, and he saw it now. Friends joking about it. Everyone watches, but Eli's eyes held no laugh. It's poison, son, distorts God's gift, turns intimacy to trash. And Micah felt it, a wave crashing, because he'd bought the lie, chased the high, and it had left him emptier. Relationships shallow, faith frayed, a temple defiled by his own hands. The coffee shop blurred, the chatter fading, and he saw his reflection in the glass. Tired, haunted, a man who'd run from light. And he muttered, I didn't know. I thought I could handle it. But Eli shook his head. You can't, not alone. Romans 12:2. Be transformed by renewing your mind. And Micah's pulse quickened, because this wasn't the end. This was a fight, a chance. And he saw Jake's pain again, Sarah's silence, his own hollow nights, all tied to this. Lust feeding fornication, pornography feeding lust. A cycle he'd spun in, and God hated it, not him, but it, the way it stole, the way it broke. Eli slid the Bible closer. 2 Timothy 2:22, flee youthful passions, pursue righteousness. And Micah nodded, his voice cracking. I want that. I'm tired of this. Because he was, exhausted by the chase, the guilt, the way it warped him, and Eli's hand gripped his shoulder. You're not alone. God's grace is bigger, John 8. The woman caught, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. And Micah's eyes burned, a tear slipping, because he'd felt condemned, trapped. But this was light, a door, a father saying, come back. And he saw it vivid, Jesus, mercy in his gaze, offering not shame, but freedom. And he'd missed it, drowned it in shadows he could have fled. The sun dipped lower, the shop's noise swelling back, and Micah scribbled fast. Lust, porn, sins of me. Because this wasn't just about rules. It was about his soul, his peace, the people he'd hurt by seeing them wrong. And he felt it, a shift, a vow clawing up. I'll fight it. I'll run. I'll ask. Because Eli was right. He couldn't alone. But God could, and he saw his phone, a trap in his pocket, a choice he'd dodged, and he muttered, "No more, not tonight," because this was the start. 2 sins last time, 2 now, 3 left, a list that scared him but freed him, and he needed it, needed the whole truth, because the shadows weren't his home, the light was. Eli smiled faint. "You're waking up, keep going." And Micah nodded, his heart pounding, because this wasn't just guilt, it was hope, a battle he'd win with help, a God who didn't quit. And he felt it, a strength rising, a call to face the rest, homosexual behavior, incest, prostitution. Because if God's grace reached here, it reached anywhere. And you've seen the shadows, but are you ready for the fight beneath? Comment, "I'm ready" below. Hit that subscribe button, because this truth's breaking through, and what's next will light up everything you've hid. The evening shadows stretched long across the park, a chill biting through the trees, the hum of dusk settling over the benches, and Micah sat beside Eli, his grandfather's Bible open on his lap. The note, "7 sins God hates," crumpled in his fist, lust and pornography still echoing from yesterday's coffee shop. Their sting fresh, a battle he'd vowed to fight. But tonight was heavier, the last 3 sins looming dark. Homosexual behavior, incest, prostitution, and he felt it, a knot in his gut, because these weren't just personal, they were raw, tangled in stories he'd heard, pain he'd seen, and he needed to know, needed to face them, because the light Eli promised, the freedom God offered, it had to reach here too. And he couldn't turn back, not now, not with 4 shadows down and 3 to go. Eli's voice broke the quiet, steady as stone. Romans 1:26-27. They exchanged natural relations for unnatural. And Micah's breath hitched, his mind flashing to a friend from college. Sam, quiet guy, came out years back. Church shunned him, and Micah had stayed silent, unsure. But now it hit. Homosexual behavior, a sin, God's word clear, not hate, not rejection, but a line, a design, marriage, one man, one woman, Christ and the church. And he saw Sam's face, hurt behind the smile, and he wondered, had he failed him? Had he missed the love? Because Eli leaned in. "It's not the only sin, Micah. All of us stray, but God's truth holds. It's not culture's call." And Micah nodded slow, his throat tight, because it wasn't easy, wasn't popular. But scripture wasn't his to bend, and he felt it, a tension. God's hate for the sin, his love for the soul, a grace bigger than the struggle. The park rustled, a breeze kicking leaves, and Eli flipped to Leviticus 18. "None shall uncover the nakedness of a close relative." And Micah's stomach turned. Incest, a word that choked, a sin dark and jagged. And he saw it, a news story years back. A family torn, a girl's eyes hollow, trust shattered, and Eli's voice dropped. It's violation, God's boundary for family, love twisted to ruin. And Micah clenched the Bible, because this wasn't abstract, this was real. Leviticus 18:6, a wall, to protect, not confine. And he felt the weight. God hated it, the pain it carved, the scars it left. And he whispered, "How does anyone heal from that?" And Eli's hand rested firm. Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is near the brokenhearted." And Micah's eyes burned. Because it was true, grace reached there, even there, a light in the blackest shadow. The sky darkened, the park emptying slow, and Eli turned to Proverbs 6:26. "The price of a prostitute, a loaf of bread, but she hunts a precious life." And Micah's mind spun. Prostitution, not just streets, but screens, trades he'd scrolled past, bodies sold, sacred turned cheap, and he saw Rahab, Joshua 2, a prostitute spared, woven into Jesus's line, Matthew 1:5, and it hit. God hated the sin, the devaluing, the hollowing, But not her, not them, and he muttered, "It's everywhere now, online, likes, trades." And Eli nodded grim. "Modern or old, it's the same. Selling what's holy. 1 Corinthians 6:19. Your body's a temple." And Micah felt it, a thread through them all. Adultery, fornication, lust, porn. These three, God's design trampled, intimacy warped, souls bruised, and he saw Sam's silence. That girl's eyes, Rahab's choice. Pain and redemption, tangled tight, because God didn't just hate, he grieved, he called back. The bench creaked under them, the night closing in, and Micah's voice broke. "Why these, Eli? Why so hard?" And Eli's eyes glinted. "Because they break what he made beautiful. They hurt you, hurt them, hurt him. But look, John 8:11, neither do I condemn." And Micah's chest heaved, because he'd judged, he'd dodged. But this was mercy, Sam not damned, that girl not lost, Rahab not trash. And he felt it, a humbling. His lust wasn't better, his fornication wasn't less. All sin, all shadows, all covered by a cross bigger than he'd grasped. He scribbled fast. Romans, Leviticus, Proverbs, grace. Because this wasn't about pointing, it was about seeing. God's love fierce through the warnings, and he saw his friend's tears, a family's wreckage, a woman's redemption, and he knew. He'd been wrong to hide, wrong to shrug because these sins hurt, but God healed, and he muttered, "I'll turn, I'll help." Because this wasn't just his fight now, it was theirs, a truth too deep to bury, too wide to ignore. The park lights flickered on, the wind sharp, and Eli smiled faint. "You're getting it, one more step." And Micah nodded, his heart pounding, because 4 down, 3 here, 7 faced, a list that broke him but built him, and he felt it, a vow rising. "I'll reject it, I'll seek him, I'll show it." Because the shadows weren't his home, the light was. And you've seen the dark, but are you ready for the grace beneath? Comment, "I'm ready" below. Smash that subscribe button, because this truth's reaching wide, and what's next will set you free. The dawn glowed soft over the church, a pale light threading through stained glass. The hum of voices rising in a hymn, warm and alive, and Micah stood at the front, his grandfather's Bible in hand. The note, 7 sins God hates, tucked safe inside, its list faced. Adultery, fornication, lust, pornography, homosexual behavior, incest, prostitution, each a shadow he'd wrestled, each a wound he'd named, the park's chill still in his bones from last night. Eli's words, "One more step," ringing true because this wasn't just about knowing now. It was about living, about breaking free, and he felt it, a fire not just flickering, but roaring. The congregation before him, not a crowd, but a family. Eyes open, hearts stirring, because he'd brought them here, shadow by shadow, to see the light beyond. And he wouldn't stop, couldn't, not with God's grace burning bright. He took a breath, his voice steady. "We've faced it, 7 sins, not to shame us, but to free us." 1 John 1:9. If we confess, he forgives, cleanses us. And the room hushed, his eyes sweeping them. All of us, me, you, we've fallen. Romans 3:23. But that's not the end, it's the start. And he saw it land, heads nodding, a woman in the back wiping tears, because this wasn't judgment. This was hope, a truth he'd fought to grasp, and he pressed on. Adultery broke trust, fornication cheapened love, lust poisoned minds, pornography numbed souls, homosexual behavior, incest, prostitution. They warped God's gift, but listen, John 8:11, "Neither do I condemn, go and sin no more." And his chest swelled because he'd felt condemned, trapped. But Jesus didn't. Jesus freed, and he saw Jake's rebuild, Sarah's silence, Sam's hurt, Rahab's rise, all covered, all reached, no sin too dark for that cross. The hymn faded, the light growing, and he flipped to Jeremiah 29:11. "Plans for welfare, not evil, a future, a hope, and his voice rose. That's for us. Not just rules, a life, God's design, intimacy holy, sacred, ours to guard. And he felt it, a shift, because he'd run from that, chased shadows but not anymore. And he saw Eli in the pew, nodding slow, because this was it, the end of hiding, the start of healing. And he said fierce, "We've got 3 steps. Repent, turn to him, 1 John again, confess it, name it, let it go." And the congregation leaned in, a man up front muttering, "I've been there." And Micah nodded. "Me too, but step 2, seek help. Don't walk alone. I've got Eli, find yours." And he saw the woman's tears turn to a smile, because this wasn't isolation. This was together, a body, a church, and he finished strong. Step 3, pursue holiness, not just fleeing sin, chasing him, prayer, word, worship, Romans 12:2, renew your mind. And the room erupted, a cheer breaking loose, because this wasn't defeat, this was victory, a plan not to bind, but to bless. The glass glowed brighter, the hymn swelling back, and Micah stepped down, his boots firm, seeing his past, nights of shame, broken bonds, not as chains now, but as scars, proof God could mend. And he saw Jake in the crowd, rebuilding slow, a girl from youth group, eyes bright, nodding because this was their story too. All 7 sins faced, not to crush, but to lift. And he felt it, a weight gone, a fire spreading, because God didn't hate him. He hated the hurt, the way it stole, and he'd missed it, drowned it in shadows he'd fled. But not anymore. Not here. A kid ran up, voice small. "So God still loves me?" And Micah knelt. "Always from the start, through it all. You're his." And the kid grinned, the crowd pressing close, because this wasn't just his truth, it was theirs. A freedom reclaimed, a purpose reborn. And he stood, his voice a call. We've been stuck, told we're lost. But God says different. He wrote us in, from Eden to now. So live it, claim it, walk it. And they cheered again, hands raised, the hymn soaring. Because this wasn't division, it was unity. A family of sinners, saved, unbroken by shadows, bound by light. The church doors swung wide, the dawn stretching full, and he saw it clear. Jesus' mercy, Rahab's redemption, a cross that took it all, a thread of grace woven through every fall, not erased but overcome. And he felt it, a vow fulfilled. I've found it, I've lived it, I'll share it. Because this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a people rising, a story reclaimed, a holiness his to chase, theirs to hold. Eli clapped his shoulder. "You've got it, son." And Micah smiled, his heart pounding, because 7 sins faced, 7 shadows fled, a light too big to dim, and he turned to them. "You're not lost, you're found. Step into it, tell it, because God's love's bigger than they ever said. And you've seen the shadows fall, but are you ready to walk in the light? Comment, 'I'm ready' below. Hit that subscribe button, because this story's yours now, and what you do next could shine brighter than you know."